All right, Senator. So you have served 2 terms, going for a third. You have seniority in Congress now. You've been there 12 years. I would say that a lot of Texas voters feel like they know who Ted Cruz is by now. What would you tell voters is something they don't know about you?
Well, listen, one of the challenges in public life is that much of how people learn about you is through the media. And I don't think it's a crazy thing to say that the media are not always fair arbiters. And so they tend to take a portion of my time in the Senate and emphasize it, and they de-emphasize a lot of the day-to-day work I'm doing every day. You know, I'd really break my job into 2 different components. One is standing up and fighting bad policies that hurt the people of Texas. And that was true whether it was Barack Obama, it was true whether it was Chuck Schumer, it was true whether it was Joe Biden. If you have policies that are open borders, if you have policies that are undermining law enforcement and endangering our families, if you have policies that are hammering small businesses and hammering Texas energy producers, I've spent 12 years leading the fight against those bad policies. That's the aspect most people know of me. At the same time, however, I've spent 12 years working every day to enact positive pro-jobs, pro-growth legislation. In my time in the Senate, I've authored and passed 100 different pieces of legislation into law. And my priority overwhelming is jobs, jobs, jobs. And that record a lot of times doesn't come through the media.
You were pointing to your time and working across the aisle. You've been highlighting your bipartisanship recently. That can be a bad word sometimes for some conservatives, but let's say you do get another 6 years, and a lot of that is going to require working across the aisle, of course. How do you reconcile your kind of unapologetic conservative persona with what the job is, you know, having to get things done in a bipartisan way?
Well, listen, I think you can walk and chew gum at the same time. I am a principled conservative, and I don't run away from that at all. But I'd also say look at my record. Literally from the day I arrived in the Senate, I have been authoring and passing bipartisan legislation. You know, one of the very first bills I worked on concerned the horrific shooting by Nidal Hasan at Fort Hood. Now, you recall there, Nidal Hasan murdered 14 innocent souls. And the Obama administration, bizarrely, refused to award the Purple Heart to the people who were shot by Nidal Hasan. They characterized that mass shooting as workplace violence rather than what it obviously was, which was a terrorist attack. I was on the Senate Armed Services Committee at the time. I introduced legislation to mandate that those who were shot by Nidal Hasan receive the Purple Heart. At the time, it was a Democrat Senate, and I got support from Democrats, from Republicans. The Obama Pentagon came in and argued against it. They did not want to give those Purple Hearts, but I got a bipartisan majority. I passed it into law. And I'll tell you, it was incredible. I was there in Fort Hood when those Purple Hearts were awarded, and either to those who were shot or for those who were killed to their families, just to look them in the eyes and say thank you. Thank you for standing up and fighting. I'm sorry that your nation's government took this long to acknowledge your service, your sacrifice. That was from the very beginning. As I said, I've been doing that for 12 years now.
So you're open to working with Democrats?
Absolutely. If you look at, all right, let's take the last bill I just passed into law. That's the FAA Reauthorization bill. That was 3 or 4 weeks ago. It is an enormously impactful law. It invests over $110 billion in aviation. Now, I was the lead author of that bill, along with Maria Cantwell. Maria Cantwell is the chairman of the Senate Committee on Commerce, Science, and Transportation. I'm the ranking member, which means I'm the senior Republican on the Senate Committee of Commerce, Science, and Transportation. The Commerce Committee has jurisdiction over about 40% of the U.S. economy. So if you care about jobs, there's no better place in the Senate to be than leading the Commerce Committee. And the FAA Reauthorization bill invested billions in enhancing aviation safety. It directed the FAA to hire the maximum number of air traffic controllers to keep the flying public safe. It invested billions in Texas airports, putting advanced technology for air traffic controllers, putting runway collision sensors on runways on the ground. It also expanded competition to lower prices for consumers. And look, aviation is a massive employer in the state of Texas. We have hundreds of thousands of jobs in Texas that depend directly on aviation. We have millions of jobs that depend indirectly on aviation. We are a global aviation leader. And this legislation had a huge impact on an industry that is critical for America. And I'll tell you one component of it that I'm really proud of. we had a massive victory for Texas and for San Antonio in particular. San Antonio right now does not have a direct flight to and from Ronald Reagan National Airport in Washington, D.C. That's not right. San Antonio is the 7th largest city in America. San Antonio, I'll tell you, the community of San Antonio for 20 years has been fighting to get that direct flight to Reagan. They came and met with me about 4 years ago. The mayor, the city council leaders, the business leaders, community leaders, they said, look, we deserve this flight. We're the 7th biggest city in America. San Antonio's nickname is Military City, USA. There's a huge military population. Reagan is right next to the Pentagon. It's right next to Arlington Memorial Cemetery. And it wasn't right. And so I told them 4 years ago, I said, I'm going to take the lead. We're going to get this done. Well, we had a knockdown, drag-out fight. This was actually the single biggest fight in the entire FAA bill. The Virginia senators and the Maryland senators were adamantly opposed. At the end of the day, I'm glad to tell you, Texas won. We got it in there. I wrote the provision. It's in the bill, and San Antonio in the coming weeks is finally going to have a direct flight to and from Reagan. That's a great example of how you can work together. And at the end of the day, that bill that I authored, it passed the Senate 88-4. So in terms of building bipartisan support, we worked together and we got a big victory for the entire country.
In February of last year, you filed a bill for a constitutional amendment. I think you might know where this is going, to limit senators to serving no more than 2 6-year terms. You said that term limits are critical to fixing what is wrong with Washington, D.C. Here you are going for a third. Why are you the exception? Take us through your thinking.
Listen, I am passionately in favor of term limits. Before I was elected to the Senate, I strongly supported term limits. Now that I've been there, now that I've seen it, I support them even more. Look, Washington, you have enormous problems with people staying far too long. But listen, I've introduced multiple times amendments to impose term limits of 2 terms for senators, 3 terms for the House. I think that would be a much better system. If and when we pass it, I will happily comply. I've never said I'm going to unilaterally apply it to myself while the other 99 don't follow the same rules. I think you need uniform rules for everyone. I'd be thrilled. If we had term limits in place and everyone was following it, I would happily go back to the private sector. It would be nice to earn some money, provide for my kids. That'd be just fine. But at the end of the day, I think Texans want someone fighting for them and fighting hard for them. When we get term limits passed, of course I will follow it. But at least right now, the career politicians, both the Democrats and the Republicans, fight against it tooth and nail.
Is part of it an age thing? Do you think you're still young enough to go for a third?
Absolutely. Look, I'm 53 years old in the Senate. That's almost a teenager. I joke the median age in the Senate is about 106. And by the way, Daniel, if you ever want to feel young, just come to the Senate. It will make you feel very, very young.
All right, Senator, I want to briefly go through some key issues for voters. I want to start with reproductive rights, specifically in vitro fertilization. Now, you and Senator Britt filed a bill in order to try and further protect IVF by stripping Medicaid funds from any state that bans IVF. But as I'm sure that you are aware, at a recent Southern Baptist Convention, the Southern Baptist Convention, they passed a resolution raising some concerns about IVF. Now, given your background, how do you wrestle with that as a Southern Baptist?
Yeah, listen, I'm not a pastor. I'm not a theologian. And pastors can work to lay out their views of faith. That's their job. My job is to represent 30 million Texans. And I can tell you what I think. I strongly support IVF. I think IVF is a medical miracle. If you look at IVF has enabled millions of parents, millions of hopeful moms and dads to bring into the world a little baby, a little boy, a little girl. You know, every year right now in the United States, about 2% of all of the births in America come from IVF. There are over 8 million babies that have been born through IVF. I think it is extraordinarily pro-family. And I have many, many dear friends whose children were conceived through IVF. Now, we're at a time politically where a lot of parents are confused and they're concerned. They're concerned that IVF might be in jeopardy. And the Alabama Supreme Court decision contributed to that. And frankly, there are more than a few Democrats who are deliberately trying to spread that confusion because they think it's politically beneficial to them. Well, As far as I know, all 100 senators support IVF. There's literally no debate on the question of IVF in the U.S. Senate. So I went to Alabama Senator Katie Britt, and I said, Katie, you support IVF, I support IVF. Let's draft legislation that is simple, that is straightforward, that protects IVF, that puts it in federal law, an ironclad protection so that nobody needs to be afraid. Nobody needs to be confused that you know that you as an American citizen have a right to access IVF technology and that no state, no local government can ban IVF. We drafted that. We filed it. Now, it's the sort of bill that on the merits, it should pass 100-0. As I said, there's literally not a single Republican, not a single Democrat who disagrees with IVF. Well, I'm sorry to tell you, Katie and I, we went to the Senate floor to try to pass my legislation. We stood up and asked for unanimous consent to pass it, and the Democrats stood up and objected. The reason our bill didn't pass is because the Democrats blocked it. And their reason for blocking it is really cynical. The Democrats don't want to pass a strong protection of IVF into federal law. Why? Because they want to spend millions of dollars in November telling the voters the mean Republicans want to take away IVF. Never mind that we're all supporting a bill to protect IVF. This is about politics and misdirection. So I thought it was one of the most cynical moments I've ever seen in the Senate when the Democrats blocked legislation, my strong legislation protecting IVF, because they want to run TV ads on it instead.
But when going back to the vote at the Southern Baptist Convention, when you saw that vote, what goes through your mind as a Southern Baptist, though? Does that bring up any kind of...
Look, everyone is entitled to make their own faith determinations, and in my view, your relationship with your Creator is your relationship with your Creator. I'm a Christian. It's a very important part. My faith is an important part of my life. But at the end of the day, my job in the Senate is not to be anyone's pastor. My job in the Senate is to fight every day for 30 million Texans, to fight for jobs, to fight for freedom, to fight for security. Those are my top three priorities: jobs, freedom, and security. And fundamentally, the freedom, look, for a mom or dad who desperately wants to love a child, IVF has proven to be an extraordinary miracle. As you know, I do a podcast every week. It's called Verdict with Ted Cruz. We've got over 1 million listeners that listen to it. We beat CNN every single week. My co-host of the podcast, Ben Ferguson, he's got 3 kids. All 3 of those kids were conceived through IVF. This is an amazing medical breakthrough. You know, it was interesting when we were trying to pass my legislation on the Senate floor on IVF with Katie Britt. We were joined by one other senator, Roger Marshall. Now, Roger Marshall's a doctor. He's an OBGYN. He's delivered thousands of babies. And he has performed IVF. He's done hundreds of cycles of IVF and delivered babies that conceived through IVF. And you literally had, I remember sitting back at the Senate floor and kind of marveling. The Democrats are trying to convince the American people that an IVF doctor, like literally someone who has performed hundreds of IVF cycles and delivered those babies, that IVF doctor is somehow anti-IVF. That's a level of cynicism. There's a reason people don't think very highly of politics, and it's those kind of games.
You mentioned your podcast, which I have been listening to. You also mentioned the word security, which you bring up border security a lot. Yes. So on that topic, we had a question. How would you balance the things that you would like to see happen when it comes to the border? Things like building the border wall, reinstating that, also reinstating the Remain in Mexico policy you've said. So how would you balance all of those with the needs and contributions of, frankly, the immigrant community in Texas?
So listen, for a long time, I've described my views on immigration in 4 words: legal, good; illegal, bad. I think most Texans agree with that. I think most Americans agree with that. As you noted, I'm the son of an immigrant. My father came from Cuba with nothing. My dad was imprisoned in Cuba. He was tortured in Cuba. When he came to Texas, it was 1957. He was a teenager. He was 18. He couldn't speak English. He had $100 in his underwear. And he went to go to the University of Texas. He was a freshman. He'd just been admitted to UT. He arrived in Austin. His very first job, he washed dishes, making 50 cents an hour. And he came to America because he was seeking freedom. Our state, our nation is built by those risking everything seeking freedom. I think that is an amazing part of our heritage. Now, that being said, there's a right way to come to this country. You follow the law, you follow the rules, you wait in line, you come legally. And I will say what's happening at our southern border, it is a crisis unlike any we've seen in the history of our country. I spend a lot of time down there. It has never been remotely this bad. We've had over 11 million illegal immigrants cross into this border illegally. And you ask, how do you fix it? You know what's frustrating? This crisis is man-made, and it is Joe Biden and Colin Allred and the Democrats that created this crisis. Why is that? Because when Biden came into office, he inherited a border that was largely secure. He inherited the lowest rate of illegal immigration in 45 years. I had worked hand in hand with President Trump, and we had largely secured the border. We'd achieved incredible victories securing the border. All Biden had to do was nothing. Just don't screw it up. But instead, what did he do? He came in and he deliberately broke the border. It was 3 decisions he made, and they were all unilateral executive decisions. Number 1, you rightly noted, he halted building the border wall. Did that on the first day in office. Number 2, he reinstated the disastrous policy of catch and release. So now that we apprehend people here illegally, they let them go. And number 3, he pulled out of the unbelievably successful Remain in Mexico agreement. Remain in Mexico is how we'd gotten the lowest rate of illegal immigration in 45 years. The result of that, the numbers exploded. And they didn't do so gradually over 6 months. They happened overnight. We went from the lowest rate in 45 years to the highest rate in the history of our country. All of that is deliberate. The good news, though, because it was done by unilateral executive action, it can be undone by unilateral executive action. And I believe if and when Donald Trump is reelected in November and we get a Republican Senate, we get a Republican House, in January, you are going to see the border secured once again because President Trump is going to reverse those 3 decisions. We're going to build the wall again. We're going to end catch and release. We're going to reinstate Remain in Mexico. And we will see the numbers plummet, which is what the people of Texas want and deserve.
You mentioned your father and his journey with immigration.
Yeah.
When you see the images of people gathered at the border en masse, and I've heard you say in other interviews that it's a sad thing to see.
Of course, it's tragic.
It is. And I'm just curious, do you see your father and those people in that crowd?
No, because my father came here legally. And there is a right way to come. And I got to say, we have millions of legal immigrants. Every year, the United States lets in about 1 million people legally. You know, there's no country on the face of the earth that is more generous with welcoming immigrants than the United States is. That's a good thing. That is a strength of our country. But there is a right way to come. What is happening at the southern border, it's interesting, Daniel. You cannot see it firsthand and defend it. There used to be a time, I was down at the border a number of months ago, and a reporter asked me, said, well, aren't the policies of the Democrats a lot more compassionate and humane when it comes to the border? I just started laughing. And I said, you know who doesn't believe that anymore? Democrats. And I just asked the reporter, I said, where's Joe Biden? Where's Kamala Harris? Where is even a single Democrat senator? Where's a single Democrat House member? By the way, where's Colin Allred? Have you seen him doing any border trips? Have you seen him going out on midnight patrol with the Border Patrol agents and encountering, as you do every time, children who've been abused, who've been brutalized? You cannot see what is happening at the southern border and defend it. Last year, 853 migrants died crossing the border illegally. When I brought 19 senators down to the border, we went out on the Rio Grande River. We saw a man floating dead in the river who had died that day. When you sit down with Texas farmers and ranchers and they show you photograph after photograph of dead bodies they find on their ranches, this is not compassionate, this is cruel. And when you go out on midnight patrol and you encounter children, little boys, little girls who've been brutalized, who've been violently brutalized by human traffickers, it haunts you. When you look in the eyes of these little kids and you understand what they've been through, when you see women who've been repeatedly raped. What is happening at our southern border, it is immoral, it is evil. And I got to say, just take the last 2 weeks. The news stories in the last 2 weeks have underscored what has happened. We had just 2 days ago a 12-year-old girl right here in Houston, Texas, murdered and in all likelihood sexually assaulted as well by 2 illegal immigrants that came into this country that Joe Biden and the Democrats let go. It's horrific. It's wrong. You look at that precious 12-year-old girl, it makes you angry. Why would you let in monsters who rape and kill children? Just a few days earlier, another illegal immigrant raped a 13-year-old girl in New York City. This monster was so sick, he videotaped himself raping this little girl. Just a few days before that, they arrested the murderer of Daniel Marin, a mother of 5 in suburban Maryland. Beautiful woman out for a jog, murdered, raped and murdered by another violent illegal immigrant that had come into this country that Joe Biden released. Just a few weeks before that, we had 8 terrorists arrested from Tajikistan, affiliated with ISIS-K. Now, Tajikistan is not to our southern border, but terrorists know, go to our southern border, and Joe Biden and the Democrats will let you into this country. They came into this country, they were apprehended, and Joe Biden and the Democrats let them go. And they were arrested plotting a terrorist attack in New York, Philadelphia, and Los Angeles. What is happening at our border? It is cruel, it is inhumane, and people are dying because of it. And what is infuriating is the Democrats aren't willing to do anything about it to stop it.
And lastly, before we let you go, I want to get into a question about the economy,
which
is, that's a biggie
yes.
for voters this cycle especially. Ranking member of the Commerce, Science, and Transportation Committee, from that vantage point, what can you all do to get these prices down for everyone?
Look, it's a great question, and in terms of inflation, there are 3 things we can do. Number 1, we've got to stop spending money we don't have. The reason inflation has taken off is because the Democrats spent trillions of dollars we didn't have, borrowed trillions of dollars we didn't have, printed trillions of dollars we didn't have. That's driven up costs for Texans who are hurting everywhere. Number 2, a big part of inflation is energy. And Joe Biden and the Democrats, including Colin Allred, have waged a war on Texas oil and gas producers. Joe Biden put a ban in place on new permits to export liquid natural gas. That hurt jobs in Texas. It hurt our allies. It helped our enemies. And amazingly enough, Colin Allred voted in favor of Joe Biden's ban on additional LNG export permits. Those are policies that hurt. If and when we win in November, we're going to end that war on energy, and we're going to lower the cost of energy. And what that's going to do is lower the cost of everything else, because energy is reflected in the cost of everything else. But number 3, I would say infrastructure is critically important to lowering costs. And as the ranking member of the Commerce Committee, and if we get a majority in November, I think we will, I'll be the chairman of the Commerce Committee, which is really good for Texas in terms of fighting for jobs in Texas. I would point to, in terms of infrastructure, number 1, 2 freeways. I-14, which will run from the Permian Basin east all the way through East Texas, all the way ultimately to the Atlantic Ocean to Georgia. I was the lead author of I-14, that legislation. I did it with Raphael Warnock, a liberal Democrat from Georgia, and Cruz Warnock. We passed it into law. That interstate is going to help create thousands of high-paying jobs. And then secondly, I-27. I-27 is going to run from Laredo north through West Texas, through the Panhandle, through New Mexico, ultimately all the way north to Canada. I-27, again, I was the lead author of that. That I did with Ben Ray Lujan, a Democrat from New Mexico. Cruz Lujan passed into law. Those 2 together are going to be responsible for billions of dollars of economic activity in Texas and thousands upon thousands of high-paying jobs. And I would say also, if you look at the Rio Grande Valley, you look at South Texas, there are right now 4 new pending bridge projects in South Texas. 2 new bridges in Laredo, 1 in Brownsville, 1 in Eagle Pass. All 4 of those bridge projects were being delayed by bureaucratic roadblocks that the Biden administration had put in place. And the Biden White House was delaying those projects by 3, 4, 5 years. It made no sense. The city leaders of Laredo came to me, mostly Democrats. They said, Ted, would you help me? We are frustrated by this White House that they're blocking these bridges. I said, absolutely. I unified the South Texas congressional delegation. We brought together every Republican, every Democrat in the South Texas delegation, all fighting together for these bridges. Ultimately, I authored legislation that expedited the permitting for all 3 bridges, that put a shot clock on the White House. It gave the president 120 days, and it said, you have 120 days to grant or deny the permits, and if you do nothing, the permits will be deemed granted automatically by operation of law. That bill was signed into law on December 22nd of last year. Actually, it was my birthday. It was a great birthday present. And just a few weeks ago, the White House finally granted the permits for those bridges. Those bridges Every year, Texas does about $800 billion of trade and commerce with Mexico. Those bridges are going to result in tens of thousands of high-paying jobs, in billions more of economic activity. They're going to help every Texas farmer, every Texas rancher, every small business, every manufacturer, and they're going to help consumers because they reduce the cost of goods getting to the grocery store, of goods getting to the store, and so it is a win-win for Texas, and it's an example of what we can do when we're focused on fighting for jobs in the state of Texas.
All right, Senator, thank you. I know you got to go. You're going to meet up with your father, so thank you so much for inviting us once again into your home.
Thank you for coming.